I spent months defending her late nights at the office. Until one video call shattered everything. She said she was working. But the man behind her, completely naked, said otherwise. That night my marriage died. And a darker version of me was born. The first thing Callan Rhodes noticed when he stepped into their Willow Heights townhouse was the quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence one appreciated after a long shift at the station. It was hollow, unnatural. No background hum from the TV, no soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen, no movement from the upper floors. The absence of life was deafening. Dropping his emergency responder gear by the front door, he scanned the dimly lit hallway. The house, which once pulsed with laughter and shared routines, now felt foreign. He pulled his phone from his pocket and saw a message from Vera Quinn, just 5 words, like a cold echo, working late again. Don't wait up. She had become a master at brevity, where once there had been poems in her texts. He didn't reply. What would he say? That he missed her? That he felt more like a ghost in his own marriage with every passing day? The words wouldn't change the fact that she likely wouldn't read it until dawn. In the kitchen, he reached for a bottle of beer and settled onto the living room couch. The television flickered on, casting dancing light across the framed photos on the coffee table. One photo always caught his eye, him and Vera on their wedding day in Lake Osage, Missouri, 5 years ago. Her joy back then had been radiant, unfiltered. Her gaze had locked onto his with trust, with certainty. He remembered believing, in that frozen moment, that had somehow stumbled into the rarest kind of love. But lately, everything had changed. At first, it was the small things. Cancelled dinner plans? Forgotten calls. Excuses that felt rushed and rehearsed. Callan, always trying to be understanding, chalked it up to stress. PR was a demanding field, after all. He wanted to believe the distance between them was temporary. But the weeks turned into months, and the space between them grew into a chasm. Conversations became logistical exchanges. Her once warm laughter had faded into silence. She no longer touched his arm when she passed by, no longer commented on his cologne, or the slight gray streak forming near his temple. They were no longer a team. They were 2 people living parallel lives, occasionally crossing paths under one roof. He finished his beer, checked the time, 11:40 p.m., and turned off the TV. As he made his way upstairs, something caught his attention. Her home office light was still on. Peeking inside, he saw her laptop on the desk, a sticky note stuck to the edge. The handwriting he knew so well read, "Meeting with Jasper, 8 p.m., Madison Hotel." Callan's pulse quickened. Jasper Cade. The name had come up before. Vera mentioned him as a new account lead, but there had always been something slightly different in the way she said it, too casual, too light. He dismissed the unease in the past, but seeing it in writing, attached to a hotel, stirred something primal in his gut. He tried to brush it off. Vera was a professional. She would never. He had to trust her. Yet, as he climbed into their bed alone, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, the feeling that something was unraveling grew stronger. Morning arrived like a slap to the face. Callan awoke to the sound of the shower running. She was home. Glancing at the clock, 6:25 a.m., he felt a strange mixture of relief and frustration. She must have come in sometime during the night, quietly, as always. He descended to the kitchen, his thoughts chaotic. There were things he needed to say, feelings that had been bottled up for too long. When she entered, she looked flawless as ever, hair perfectly styled, dressed in a pale lavender blouse tucked into a charcoal skirt. She looked like the same woman he married, but he could no longer recognize the warmth that once defined her. He offered her a cup of coffee he had already made, hoping it might spark some familiarity. She accepted it without much eye contact. She mentioned an early meeting. He asked if they could talk. She hesitated, checked the time, and finally offered a short apology, citing stress. Then, as if offering a lifeline, she suggested dinner that evening, just the 2 of them. The hope it ignited in him was immediate and painful. He agreed, promising to make something special. That day, Callan threw himself into preparation. He visited a local organic market in Brookside to gather fresh scallops, seasonal vegetables, and her favorite Pinot Noir from a boutique wine shop she adored. Back home, he carefully prepared everything: pan-seared scallops and lemon butter, wild rice with herbs, and roasted broccolini. He lit candles, arranged flowers, and even ironed the sapphire shirt she used to compliment. At 7 p.m., he waited, the table perfectly set. By 7:30, the scallops had cooled. By 8 o'clock, the candles began to flicker low. He texted her, no response. At 9 o'clock, he called, his voice calm but loaded with disappointment. It went to voicemail. He left a message soft, hoping she'd still show up. When she finally called at 10:03, her voice was clipped, distant. She said she was finishing work. Callan felt something inside him shift, like a thread being pulled too far. He asked for a video chat. After hesitation, she agreed. And when the screen came to life, he saw it. Vera was in a hotel room, not at her office. The decor, the lighting, it was all wrong. And then the final blow: another man appeared behind her. Shirtless. Casual. Real. Everything else blurred. The betrayal was not just confirmed, it was burned into his memory. He ended the call. His heart collapsed under the weight of denial, pain, and rage. Then came the destruction. Plates shattered. Wine spilled. The roses he'd picked up earlier lay crushed on the tile. Her clothes, once neatly arranged, were thrown from drawers and closets. He packed them all into a suitcase, no longer caring about the order. By the time she arrived home, the storm had already swept through. The confrontation that followed shattered what little remained of their bond. And as Callan stood in the ruins of their life together, the man who had once believed in forever finally understood the truth. Some endings don't come with warning signs, they come with silence. Callan Rhodes stood alone in the wreckage of what used to be a shared life. The walls of their once warm home now echoed with the consequences of betrayal. Vera Quinn was gone, her suitcase taken without ceremony, and the house felt colder than ever before. Yet it wasn't the emptiness that hurt, it was the sharp clarity that came with knowing. No more wondering, no more doubt. Just truth, raw and unfiltered. Sleep had evaded him that night. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind refused to slow. By the time morning light crept through the curtains, his world had already shifted irreversibly. The plans, the hopes, the sense of partnership, it was all scorched. And in its place was something darker, the urge to retaliate. Emmer Sloane had known something was wrong the moment he heard Callan's voice. They'd been friends since grade school in Ridgeview, and over the years, their bond had endured relocations, breakups, job changes, and more. When Callan shared what had happened, every devastating detail, Emmer didn't offer platitudes. Instead, he showed up at the house within the hour, his concern hidden behind a layer of simmering fury. The living room still bore the evidence: broken glass, overturned furniture, floral remnants staining the rug. Emmer didn't comment on the destruction. He simply listened. And when Callan finished speaking, his friend's eyes narrowed, not with pity, but with purpose. He refused to let this betrayal end with Callan silently licking his wounds. In Emmer's mind, Vera had made a conscious decision to shatter the life they built, and she shouldn't walk away unscathed. The idea took shape fast, too fast. Revenge. Not just emotional closure, but something tangible. Something she'd feel. At first, Callan resisted. He wasn't the kind of man who plotted against others, no matter the pain. But as Emmer laid out the plan, collected, logical, almost surgical, it started to make a terrible kind of sense. Vera's professional world was pristine, polished, carefully maintained. Her reputation in the public relations industry was her currency. What if the truth leaked into that world? That evening, they returned to the house to gather what Emmer called documentation. Vera's laptop remained untouched in her office, almost as if it had been waiting for them. Callan's hands trembled as he opened it, half expecting to be locked out, but the screen flickered to life without resistance. Another sign of how confident, or careless, she had become. Within minutes, the truth unfolded in cruel detail. Dozens of emails between Vera and someone named Jasper Cade. The language was flirtatious, intimate, and undeniable. Their conversations spanned months, each thread laced with a growing comfort that Callan no longer recognized. Worse still, some emails had photo attachments, images that ripped open wounds Callan didn't know he still had. He shut the laptop, bow rising in his throat. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was sustained. Ongoing. Carefully hidden. Emmer's voice brought him back to reality. They had what they needed. Now it was time to decide what to do with it. The plan was simple: send a discreet email to Vera's agency's senior leadership. Not explicit, not vulgar, just enough to raise eyebrows and cast shadows. Emmer insisted on keeping Callan's name out of it. The point wasn't to get him in trouble, it was to let the weight of her actions collapse her carefully constructed image. Callan hesitated before pressing send. His conscience twisted against the idea. Part of him still remembered their honeymoon, her laugh echoing across the coast of Maine, the promises they'd whispered when no one else was listening. But the pain was louder now, and it drowned out the nostalgia. With one tap, the email was gone. The days that followed moved like slow tides. Callan returned to work at the local emergency response unit, burying himself in double shifts. Saving strangers from fire and trauma felt easier than sitting alone in a house filled with silence. But even at the firehouse, the thoughts crept in. Who had he become? A man who sought retribution instead of healing? One morning, a message from Vera popped onto his phone, brief, tense, and filled with barely contained panic. Her boss had suspended her pending an internal review. She knew, or at least suspected, who was behind the leak. Callan didn't reply. He showed the message to Emmer, who grinned like a man watching justice unfold. It had begun. But as the first cracks appeared in Vera's career, Callan didn't feel victorious. The emptiness remained. The question gnawed at him: was this justice? Or just a new kind of destruction? Still, the wheels had been set in motion, and turning back no longer felt like an option. The unraveling of Vera Quinn's professional life had begun with a single email, but the aftermath moved like an avalanche, quiet at first, then impossible to stop. Callan Rhodes watched it all unfold from a distance, disconnected and strangely numb. Messages from colleagues, vague posts on industry forums, even silence from mutual friends, all pointed to a growing scandal. Vera had built her name carefully, one campaign at a time. But it took only a few carefully placed leaks to crack the polished surface. Each whisper in her world of polished reputation chipped away at the foundation she had once stood so confidently on. She had tried reaching out to Callan, her tone shifting from panic to pleading, but he remained silent. Her downfall, though not complete, had clearly begun. Emmer Sloan remained in his corner, fanning the flames. He believed they were doing what needed to be done, retribution, not cruelty. But Callan felt increasingly unsettled. The more their plan succeeded, the less satisfaction it brought him. Instead of feeling healed, he felt hollow. The weight of what they were doing hit hardest when Callan saw Vera in person for the first time since that night. He had just completed a brutal 24-hour shift at the Northgate fire station when he found her waiting beside his truck. She looked like a ghost of herself, hair undone, circles under her eyes, the usual confident energy stripped away. She barely resembled the woman who once captivated him on their wedding day. Her voice cracked as she asked him to stop. She spoke of her reputation, her years of effort, the collapse of her career. But Callan stood frozen, hearing her words without truly listening. A part of him wanted to care, another part remembered the hotel, the man, the betrayal. The sharp edge of memory cut through any tenderness that tried to return. She begged for a chance to explain, to fix what had been broken. But he had nothing to offer her except a stare that no longer held love. Whatever was once between them had turned to ash. Callan walked away that night with something heavier than vengeance clinging to him. Vera's voice stayed in his mind, not the words, but the way she said them. There was no longer defiance or anger. There was loss. Genuine, human loss. And it haunted him. Back at home, Emmer was waiting, full of fire and next steps. He had new ideas, new channels, more ways to push the pressure. But Callan hesitated. The darkness was no longer outside of him, it was inside now. He could feel it. The anger that once motivated him had mutated into something colder, and he no longer recognized the man who stared back at him in the mirror. When Callan admitted his doubts, Emmer snapped. His loyalty, once a comfort, had grown possessive. He had poured himself into the mission of vengeance, and took any hesitation personally. The argument was brief, but heavy. Emmer saw Callan's wavering as betrayal. Callan, meanwhile, saw in his friend a reflection of what he was becoming, and didn't want to be. The silence that followed their confrontation was more painful than expected. Emmer had always been the brother he never had. But the road they walked together had become too steep, too dark. Despite the fracture, Callan couldn't undo what they'd already set in motion. The emails, the rumors, the suspicion, it all snowballed beyond their control. He told himself it was justice, but each night brought dreams that said otherwise. Dreams where he saw Vera crying, not from guilt, but from being broken. Dreams where he heard himself shouting, not with anger, but with grief. Work became the only escape. At the station, the chaos made sense. Fires had rules. People screamed, but not in riddles. Pain had immediate reasons. Saving lives was simpler than saving a heart. His captain pulled him aside one day, concern in his voice. Callan brushed it off, but deep down, he knew something was unraveling. He had become someone who acted without compassion. Who watched someone he once loved fall apart, and did nothing to stop it. Who stood by while others whispered about her with glee. And yet, he didn't stop. Not right away. Not when she lost another client. Not when she stepped back from public work. Not even when mutual friends began to disappear from both their lives. It wasn't until he sat alone one morning, coffee growing cold, inbox filled with unread messages, that something shifted. A message from Vera sat unopened. The subject line was simple, please. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. He already knew. That was the moment he realized the cost of revenge wasn't just her career, it was his soul. The days that followed were quieter, though not in any comforting way. The fire of revenge that had once kept Callan Rhodes upright now smoldered into a thick, lingering smoke inside him. He had stopped replying to Emmer Sloane's messages, ignored his calls, even left a few texts unread. Something had shifted, gradually at first, then all at once. The war they had declared on Vera Quinn had been won. But the victory tasted like ash. Callan had tried to go back to his routines. The long shifts at the fire station, the gym, late-night walks through his new neighborhood in East Fairwood. But even in the quietest corners, guilt followed. He didn't hear from Vera for almost a week. Until one morning, sitting in his car outside her old office building, curiosity or conscience, he didn't know which, pushed him to go inside. The receptionist didn't recognize him at first. When he asked for Vera, her response came with a note of sympathy. Vera had resigned days ago. No forwarding contact. No goodbye email. She had just walked away. Callan left the building with lead in his legs. She hadn't fought for her job. She hadn't tried to repair her reputation. She had simply let go. It was only later, standing outside the house they used to share, that he realized why it hit him so hard. She hadn't just lost her job. She had lost herself. And maybe, in his effort to hurt her, he had pushed her further than even he intended. He hadn't planned on knocking. But his hand moved before he could think. The door opened slowly, and there she stood. Vera looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but energetically. Her presence, once commanding, was now brittle. No makeup. Slippers. A faded sweatshirt. Her eyes met his, and there was no anger in them, only exhaustion. He entered quietly, following her into the living room. The space had changed. Warmer lighting, new throw pillows, fewer photos on the walls. But it still smelled faintly like the lavender candles she used to light on quiet Sundays. They sat far apart on the couch. Between them, an invisible canyon made of everything that had been said and done. Callan cleared his throat. The words he had rehearsed in his mind on the way there came out uneven and halting. He acknowledged the messages, the rumors, the emails. He took responsibility, full, unfiltered. Said he had been consumed by hurt, blinded by betrayal, driven by a desire to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had caused him. But it hadn't helped. It hadn't healed anything. It had only broken more pieces. Vera didn't interrupt. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a crack in the hardwood floor. When he finally stopped speaking, she nodded slowly. Then she said something he didn't expect. She knew. She had suspected from the beginning who was behind it. She hadn't said anything because, in some strange way, she thought she deserved it. She spoke of guilt, not just for what happened in the hotel room, but for all the nights she'd pulled away, for all the quiet decisions that eroded what they once had. She hadn't meant to destroy their marriage, but she hadn't done anything to save it either. There were no raised voices. No accusations. Just sorrow, like a fog between them. When she asked him why he had come, he told her the truth. He didn't want to be that man anymore. The man who hurt to feel powerful. The man who watched someone drown and threw stones instead of a rope. Vera reached out, not for his forgiveness, and not to ask for hers, but simply to hold his hand for a moment. They sat there like that, hand in hand, surrounded by the quiet remains of something that had once been beautiful. There was no talk of getting back together. They both knew too much had changed. But for the first time in months, they weren't adversaries. Just two broken people, trying to breathe in the same room. As Callan stood to leave, she didn't follow. She just offered a soft nod, her eyes glistening but calm. He stepped outside into the cool air, the door closing gently behind him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel rage in his chest. Just sadness, and oddly, a flicker of peace. The war was over. The fire was out. And somewhere beneath the rubble, maybe, just maybe, something could grow again. A month had passed since Callan Rhodes walked out of the house he once called home for the final time. The memories still lingered in quiet corners of his new apartment, but the weight they carried had started to shift. No longer anchors, they now floated like dust, present, but no longer suffocating. Each morning brought routine. Coffee brewed slowly, classical music replaced the silence, and sunlight painted long shadows across bare floors. The space wasn't perfect. Boxes remained unpacked, and the furniture was minimal, but it was his. And for now, that was enough. He had stopped checking Vera's social media. Eventually, he even blocked it altogether, not out of anger, but necessity. Healing demanded space, and space required boundaries. The last time they spoke, they had both agreed, no more trying to fix what had been shattered. Just time. Time to soften the edges of what had once been sharp. Emmer Sloane hadn't reached out since their confrontation. Callan didn't blame him. What began as solidarity had turned into something darker. They had walked a road together that neither of them should have taken. Callan had tried to make amends, reaching out once with a message that went unanswered. Still, he hoped that one day Emmer might understand why he had chosen to stop. The evidence, the emails, the screenshots, the photos, had all been deleted. What little remained was put in a folder, and buried deep in a hard drive Callan no longer opened. It didn't belong in his life anymore. Revenge had offered a brief illusion of control, but it had left his soul threadbare. Moving on meant letting go, not only of her, but of who he had become because of her. He had sent an anonymous follow-up to Vera's former firm. A quiet email. No details, no grand explanations. Just a single sentence. Some of the information you received was exaggerated or false. Please disregard anything unverified. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was closure, wrapped in silence. Life had slowed down in a way that felt deliberate. Callan took more shifts at the firehouse, not to escape, but to engage. Saving others reminded him of the man he used to be. A man who acted with purpose, not bitterness. His captain had noticed the change, offering subtle nods of approval without saying much. In their line of work, words were often too fragile. The apartment had become a space of healing. He bought new cookware and started cooking again, nothing elaborate, but nourishing. He began sketching, something he hadn't done since high school. Blank pages filled with lines that had no destination, but helped him breathe easier. He even picked up a second-hand bike and started exploring the city like he was rediscovering it from the beginning. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, his phone buzzed. A name flashed across the screen he hadn't seen in weeks. Emmer. Just one sentence. "How are you holding up, man?" Callan stared at it for a long time. His thumb hovered, not out of hesitation, but contemplation. Then he replied, "Better. A lot better." They didn't say more that night, but something about that brief exchange gave Callan hope. Not everything could be rebuilt, but some things, with time, might grow back differently. He stood by the window, sipping his coffee, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere out there, Vera was living her own new version of reality. He didn't know where she worked now, or whether she still lit those lavender candles. But he wished her peace. Not because she deserved it or didn't, but because he did. The pain hadn't disappeared. It still visited on quiet nights and slow mornings. But it no longer dictated the rhythm of his life. He had learned that healing wasn't a final destination, it was a decision made over and over again. That night, he took out a blank sheet of paper. Not for a letter, not for a plan, just for whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking back.